good morning, good afternoon, good evening, anytime you get to watch this. This is Jojo of Demons Media. Now, in the world where power dynamics are shifting, it is hard to ignore Africa, a continent of over a billion people out of the UN Security Council. This is what President Ruto is demanding, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch his reaction, or let's watch his presentation at the UN General Assembly, and let us come back to have a conversation. Let's watch this.
Nations. Today, the global context is vastly different. The global standard collapsed 5 decades ago, and Europe has long since been rebuilt. Yet, the governance of these institutions has not kept pace with needs of a multipolar world, especially the needs of poor and developing nations. The mismatch between shareholders and stakeholders has become starkly visible. For instance, during the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy nations. Just imagine. 64%. With little need for liquidity support. They didn't need the money anyway, but they got 64%. While the poorer countries received just 2.4%. What a disconnect. The imbalance highlights how the very institutions meant to safeguard global finance stability often perpetuate inequality and instability. I have argued, and I say it again, that the current global financial architecture punishes poor countries with high interest rates and enormous conditionalities, while rewarding rich nations with lower interest rates and softer lending rates. Its rules, priorities, and allocation mechanisms consistently favor those already prosperous, while trapping vulnerable economies in cycles of debt, high borrowing costs, and inadequate access to emergency support and concessional funding. It is imperative to transform these institutions into genuinely independent, apolitical global bodies that their operations are aligned with their global mandate. Such a shift would democratize decision-making, restore credibility, and allow the IMF and the World Bank to serve all countries fairly rather than reinforcing old hierarchies. But Africa is not merely waiting for external prescriptions. We are taking bold and deliberate steps to strengthen our financial independence, safeguard our stability, and accelerate our development. Kenya, for instance, fully endorses the establishment of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, launched with the Africa Union in February 2024. This alliance brings together our homegrown banks, Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Africa Re, Africa Development Bank, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEP-RE, institutions that embody Africa's determination to mobilize resources, finance trade, and build resilience on our own terms. At the same time, the Africa Union is championing 3 transformative institutions: the Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money; the Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty; and the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established. Excellencies, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, Africa also marks 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the City Declaration, the 2 historic milestones that establishes the common African position on UN Security Council reforms. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. If the United Nations is to remain relevant in this century, it must reflect today's realities, not the post-war power arrangements of 1945. Madam President, despite the stated and evident weaknesses of the United Nations, it still remains humanity's best chance at global solidarity. No other institution has the universal legitimacy or convening power of the UN. From coordinating humanitarian relief in times of war and disaster, to mobilizing the global response to COVID-19, to driving consensus on climate change, through the Paris Agreement, the UN has consistently shown that the world can achieve together what no nation can accomplish on its own, however mighty or great or powerful. As Doug Hammarskjöld, the UN's Second Secretary General, once observed, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from hell." End of quote. That mission is as urgent today as it was 8 decades ago. At a time when conflicts are multiplying, when climate change threatens every economy, and when inequality is widening, the need for a functioning, credible, effective, and a multilateral system has never been greater. It is through the UN that nations have pooled resources to vaccinate billions of children, to protect refugees from through the work of the UNHCR, and to keep the peace in more than 70 missions across the world. Without the UN, these achievements, modest though they may sometimes seem, would not have been possible.
Welcome back. Isn't it interesting? Little did I know the significance that Kenya has made when it comes to Haiti. It's amazing of his statistics. Now, let me put it out here. This is not his entire presentation. I have to shorten it. But when you listen to his entire presentation, you get to know he really did acknowledge the part that UN has played in the world, in a time of pandemic, in a time of war and other stuff. But at the same time, put a demand on UN, because now one of them is this: how do you make security decisions around people without including them. That lead to the point where he said that we demand a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, both permanent and unpermanent, because at the end of the day, you can't make decisions around a whole group of people without involving them. That's not right. And he also made demands. The demand that he just put across were viable demands, and these are things that the whole African continent, the leaders, have been drumming in on about. And for instance, making funds available. How do you go about giving funds to countries that do not need it and ignoring the countries that needs the funds? It doesn't well and truly match up, does it? And then you look at the point where he also spoke about the credit ratings of the West, the fact that the West credit rating is always biased negatively against Africa, which makes it very hard for investment to come onto the continent. We have our own credit rating in Africa now. It's beautiful to hear these things, you know, and then we have our own monetary bank set up for us to draw loans and stuff from at a lower percentage of rate, which is something that Muammar Gaddafi, the late president of Libya, had drummed in about, had wanted to see it happen, but it has still happened. As a Pan-Africanist, it's beautiful to hear these things, not just the fact that they are talking and venting out what they need to vent out. However, it has happened, and we are grateful. I love to hear these things. And what do you think about His Excellency's presentation? Let's share ideas. You think he said the needful things that needed to be said? Let us share these things. End of the day, I'm sitting out here ranting on back. What do I know? Still, this is my take.